So, is that the flash? Okay. Is that bothering you?
No.
Okay. Um, so tell me what's going on here. Why did you decide to bring your message here to Texas?
Well, I was invited here to talk at a rally for traditional marriage by Dr. Stephen Hotze, the Republican head of the um, caucus, I guess you would
Right.
call it.
The conservative Republicans of
Conservative
Texas.
Republican, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, why did you accept the invitation? Or why did you think it was
Well,
important?
because I think it's a very important issue that faces our country, and I think there's a lot of things that people need to understand about the alignment of courts, about the jurisdiction of federal courts, and about how federal courts have really wrongfully entered into 23 states now and ordered same-sex marriage when they really have no jurisdiction to do so. And it is the right of every state to contest this through their own state trial court and Supreme Court opinions. And if they did that, they would stop any effort by the federal court to change the constitutional amendments in their state. As Texas has a constitutional amendment voted on by some 76% of the people. In Alabama, we had 81% of the people. And in Alabama, we did stop the federal court intrusion into our state, and no probate judges are issuing licenses as of the state.
None are? I thought one was the one that was the
One issued 4 by order of that court.
Okay.
But thereafter, the Supreme Court ordered that no others would be issued by him because they were not covered by an order.
Well, what about the supremacy clause? Don't federal courts have power over state courts ultimately?
Absolutely not under
No.
the Supremacy Clause. Under
Okay.
the Supremacy Clause, do you know what it says?
What does it say?
Article 6 states that this Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding, which simply means that state judges are under an equal responsibility and authority to interpret the federal Constitution. That federal Constitution is supreme over the state constitution and laws of the state. Nevertheless, a federal judge's ruling is not law, and that's a basic problem with people saying federal law trumps state law. Federal law does trump state law if you're talking about the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution of the United States over the Constitution of the state of Alabama or state of Texas. But when you're talking about a federal court opinion, it's a far different proposition. Federal court opinion is a ruling on a case, applying the law according to that opinion. What's interesting about this, though, is federal courts traditionally, from the outset of the Constitution, had no authority over marriage and divorce or parent and child relationships. That was Haddock versus Haddock in 1906. It was De Silva case in, I think it's 1956. It was In re Burris in 1890, I believe. These cases are all cited in United States of Windsor versus Windsor in 2013. So even the United States Supreme Court hasn't assumed to intrude into state sovereignty in the issue of marriage. That's what this case is all about before the United States Supreme Court, coming up in April and be decided probably in June. Yet, every federal court that has done this previously has simply gone against their own history, their own law, and their own precedent.
So what if the Supreme Court rules in favor of same-sex marriage? What then?
Well, I
Where-
don't think
where does
that,
this
I don't
end?
think they will, because it would involve states' rights. I don't think they should, because there's no word marriage in the Constitution. The word family is not in the Constitution.
Why would they decline to hear appeals of rulings striking down federal appeals court rulings striking down marriage bans if they're not going to rule in favor of same-sex marriage?
You're talking about the Alabama case?
No, they declined. The Supreme Court has declined to decline cert in several cases where federal appeals courts have struck down
they
marriage
don't
bans.
have to take them. I mean, if that's issue of certiorari. They don't have to take the cases. Why they would do that, I don't know, but it certainly doesn't necessarily mean the way they're going to rule. Now, I simply say that the Supreme Court can be wrong in ruling, as you well know. They've been throughout history. 1857, it was the Dred Scott case where they said black people were property. It was clearly an unconstitutional ruling. Lincoln said he wouldn't follow it. You can go to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, I believe it was. And in that case, they said that separate but equal was the rule of the courts. And of course, both of those opinions were later overturned. So we know that if they go in and they don't redefine marriage, they just strike down laws of states that have defined marriage. They have no basis to do that but their own feelings. And there was a justice in the case of Dred Scott by the name of Benjamin Curtis from Massachusetts, who stated exactly what goes on today when the strict interpretation of the Constitution is abandoned and the theoretical opinions of individuals allowed to control its meaning. We have no longer a Constitution. We're under a government of individual men, and today women, who for the time being have the power to declare what the Constitution is according to their own views of what they think it ought to mean. In other words, when you start making up words and defining words, it's all about power. And if you do that, then people that follow you on the court will go further and further take away rights and liberties.
So what happens then, though? Do you disobey that ruling?
There's
Do the
nothing
states
to
disobey?
disobey. I dissent every time it comes before me.
You dissent?
Well, sure, I dissent.
Well, but the states are going to have to issue marriage licenses, right?
Well, they may do so over my dissent. But nothing can change my oath to the Constitution.
But some people are calling for civil disobedience and even going to jail to protest such a decision.
I think that's a right people have.
Would you do that?
Well, the time comes, I'll make those decisions then.
So do you think Texas should follow your lead and let's say the Fifth Circuit, for example, strikes down the marriage ban?
Fifth Circuit can't strike down the marriage ban.
They
That's
can't?
the whole point. The United States Supreme Court can strike down the marriage ban, and the Texas Supreme Court itself can uphold that marriage ban. And that issue would then have to be resolved between the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court by the United States Supreme Court.
So you're hoping Texas and other states will follow your lead?
Well, I think Texas should follow its lead and stand up for its constitutional amendment. It's what the people voted on in Texas, not what I voted on. And certainly it doesn't contradict the Constitution, in my opinion. And if the state Supreme Court would issue a ruling, then they would clarify it for the people of Texas. It would be up then to the United States Supreme Court's ruling later in June.
Well, a lot of people say this is all going to go away in June when they rule. But you don't necessarily agree with that.
I don't think this is going to go away. I think this is more about force and about intimidation than we realize. And I think you're still going to have a myriad of cases of people being forced to bake cakes, make flowers, perform weddings, rent whatever you want to talk about to same-sex couples under the supposed civil rights of those individuals, which this is not a civil rights issue, in my opinion.
What about those who say it is, and they say this is nothing but hate and bigotry?
Nobody hates people, but the institution of marriage is not something you have to hate people to uphold. Every person has a right to enter a marriage relationship with a person of the opposite sex, as it's always been for hundreds, even thousands of years. To uphold the institution of marriage isn't to hate anybody or bigotry against anybody. In fact, they don't even suggest a definition of marriage. You can't hate people just because they want no definition of marriage.
So it's not animus.
No, it's not animus. It's upholding the domestic policy of the state of Alabama, the state of Texas, or any of the states of the Union. It's about resisting the unlawful force of federal courts who have no authority there in the first place. And it's about state courts standing up for their rights to rule on federal constitutional questions like the law provides for them. And Clarence Thomas said this in 1993, as I said, in Lockhart versus Federal. He said it very clearly. He said in our federal system, the state trial court's interpretation of the federal constitution is just as authoritative as the federal district court of appeals in whose circuit the trial court is situated. So this is a matter of law, not a feeling.
You said it's not about hate or animus.
No.
Do you still think that homosexuality should be illegal?
I think homosexuality should be illegal. Sodomy was declared illegal by the United States Supreme Court in 1987. It said there was no right under the Constitution to enlarge the fundamental rights of homosexuals.
But then they came back and overturned it.
Well, surely they overturned it. They didn't go by their own precedent, did they?
No,
I thought they were supposed to go by precedent. Isn't that right?
Yeah, but so you're hoping that decision will get overturned again someday.
Well,
What should be the punishment for homosexuality?
well, I don't get into that. In
I mean, how serious?
1960, every state in the Union had laws against sodomy.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning of the country, in 1776, all 13 colonies had laws against sodomy.
Mm-hmm.
So sodomy is historically against the law. It's only been since 2003 when Justice Kennedy, writing for the Supreme Court, says it was a right of privacy, but it was not to be brought into the public arena.
But some people who interpret the Bible strictly say that actually it should be punished by death. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't, I'm not here to outline any punishments for sodomy. That's far beyond any issues I've come in contact with.
Yeah.
I can't help what some people say, what some people do.
But you don't have an opinion about what you think the punishment should be?
No.
Okay. But this is not a losing, it's a losing battle. But you don't necessarily believe that. I mean, the vast majority of the country now supports same-sex marriage.
No, the vast majority
60%,
of the country does not support same-sex marriage.
You don't believe the polls?
The polls don't say that a vast majority support. In fact,
A solid majority.
The polls state that a solid majority does not support same-sex marriage. And you talk about these 37 states where it's been legalized, that's by order of federal courts. Read the polls. Go back and read the polls. Take the polls in Texas, and you'll find out the majority of people do not support same-sex marriage. And you don't go by majority. If you look at the state of Texas, do you think that now the state of Texas majority supports same-sex marriage? Is that your opinion? Have you got a poll to support that?
There is one poll that shows a plurality. It was a 48% to 47%. A Texas Tech poll last year. The most recent poll showed that about 42% support it, and that's a significant increase from several years ago.
But it's still not the majority, is it?
Not in Texas,
No. Not in
but
Texas.
nationwide it is.
Not in Alabama.
Right.
Well, polls, polls are polls, and you can get anything on a poll you want to.
Well, can you talk briefly about your son? That he's made news recently with some arrests.
I'm not here to talk about my son. It's a personal matter. It's a family matter.
Okay, but he's brought up the issue that he feels like liberals are retaliating against you
My
by
son's got
getting.
his own opinions, and they don't necessarily reflect mine.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time.
I love my son. And, I wait to see the outcome of this case.
But you don't necessarily share his opinion that this is retaliation against you through him.
I don't know what motivated police officers to do what they did.
So you think it might be?
I don't express an opinion on it.
But you don't know what other reason they would have for.
No opinion is no opinion.
Fair enough. I appreciate the time.
You're welcome.